only thing we have to fear is
in war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we burn, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Calvin Coolidge said, "The more I study the Constitution, the more I realize that no other document devised by the hand of man has brought so much progress and happiness to humanity. To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race."
Welcome to Foundations of Freedom Thursday here on WallBuilders Live. That means we're going to talk about the foundations, our foundational principles. What was it that made America so great, and how do we get back to those principles? Special day each week where we dive a little deeper into the Constitution and Declaration and the principles that undergird our economic and political structures. David, we cover a lot of different topics on Foundations of Freedom. We've kind of even basically gone through the Constitution one piece at a time. Today we're going to talk a little bit about that first freedom in the First Amendment, talking about that right of conscience, that right of religious liberty. It's been on our show a lot the last few weeks because of what happened in Houston, but this one is fundamental, man. If we don't have the right to speak about what we believe, then we must be in tyranny.
Yeah, free speech is actually a double protection for religious speech. You know, people think that the free speech is the great protection, but religion actually gets double protection in the First Amendment because you get the right to freedom of speech and to practice your religion on top of that. And oftentimes those two are tied together. What you say is often driven by what you believe in the religious realm. And so when you start affecting and trying to punish people for what they believe, you're trying to affect their speech. And at that point, the Constitution actually gives a double protection for religious folks. It gives a single protection for non-religious folks. You got a right to freedom of speech. But for religious folks, you got a right to practice your faith according to the dictates of conscience and to speak according to that. And so that is, as you said, one of the first freedoms. I mean, if you look at the original charters done in America out of the various colonies, one of the things they did was protect rights of conscience right up front. They protected religious speech. You got free speech protection, but also religious speech protection. And now, and by the way, they did that because they came from a continent where the government was regulating speech and regulating their freedom of religion. And they said, look, there's got to be separation of church and state. Government is not supposed to be in charge of affecting what we and the church can do. It was not the church taking over the government. It was the government trying to take over the church. And now we're seeing this in many places. Most recently, we've seen it in Houston with what the mayor there tried to do. And for folks who don't know the situation in Houston, the mayor there in Houston was elected open homosexual and then started moving through all sorts of homosexual agenda items. And one of them was what was called the HERO measure, H-E-R-O. And that stands for Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. And so as they tried to push through HERO, or Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, it gave protection for transgenders to choose any bathroom they wanted to. And across the country, that's been shown to be a really difficult problem. You have boys walking into girls' bathrooms or girls' locker rooms or girls' whatever saying, I feel like a girl today. And then you have women who talk about how unsafe they feel because men can walk into their bathroom. And so it goes against common sense, and it goes really against the people. So in that town, a number of churches said this is not right. The city council ignored us. We were at the city council talk about this. They crammed it down our throats. And they're not wanting us to talk about homosexual issues or gender issues, etc. And we're going to do that because the Bible says that. And so as a result of that, they started a petition to get that ordinance placed on the ballot. Let's see if the people support this or if it's just the leaders trying to cram it down our throat. And when that happened, you had the mayor step up and subpoena 5 pastors, wanted 17 forms of communication from those 5 pastors. In those 17 forms of communication, I want to hear your sermons. I want to hear if you talked about these issues in your sermons. I want to see if you've talked about these issues on your Facebook or Twitter account. I want to see the emails you've done or the posts you've done. Because you're a pastor and you don't have the right of free speech. You don't have the right to practice your faith in public. And if you've been talking to others about this on Facebook, or if you've been tweeting others about this, I need to know about it. I'm subpoenaing all your sermons and all 17 forms of communication. So we're now back in Europe 400 years ago is exactly what we have. And this was based on something that came out of El Paso a few years ago, back before even the gay marriage thing had taken off. I think this is probably 6 or 7, 8 years ago. In El Paso, you had the El Paso City Council that said, we're going to do domestic partnerships, the equivalent of homosexual marriage. And in Texas, we'd passed a constitutional amendment that said you can't do that. But the city said, well, we can. And so the city council passed that. Well, then they had enough signatures to put it in a ballot initiative, and so the city voted, the citizens voted on that and voted it down. They did not want domestic partnerships in El Paso. So after the election, the city council came back in and set aside the election, said we're going to do it anyway. And at that point, folks who had been behind getting the ordinance voted on said, oh, we're going to have a recall election. You folks that just got in office that are ignoring the vote we just had and think that you know more than we're going to recall you. And so obviously people who supported traditional marriage are behind that, including churches. And the city goes to court and gets an injunction against churches from being able to talk about recall petitions. They're not, so they don't even have the right to participate in the political process. They can't do a recall of civic officials. They have less than the rights of an ordinary citizen because they're faith people.
They've lost their voice simply because of their faith. You talk about discrimination.
That's it. And so what's happened is that's what's going on in Houston now. And if you don't have the historical perspective to know that this is what Europe was 400 years ago, you don't understand why we got religious liberties. And it was for this kind of stuff right here. This is what separation church and state was all about. And one of the guys really good about talking about this is the guy who and we have Matt Staver on regularly. Matt's a great friend with Liberty Counsel. They fight these battles across the country. But the guy who's in charge of the Liberty Counsel office here in Texas is a guy named Matt Krause. And Matt's a good friend. He's a state representative. These are the kind of cases that he had to fight in Texas. And we thought, let's get Matt on to talk about what's happened here in Houston and to talk about what the mayor's trying to do and what this really means for all Christians everywhere in the nation. Because this is not isolated Houston. It's going on, as you mentioned, we had Jack Hibbs on. We've had the situation in Idaho, the situations in Arizona. We've had situations in Florida. It's going across the nation. And so we have to get re-educated on what our rights are and what we have. And particularly as people of faith, we get double protection. We don't get less protection.
Matt Krause will be with us when we return, formerly with Liberty Counsel, now a state representative here in Texas. Stay with us right here on WallBuilders Live.
Thomas Jefferson said, the constitutions of most of our states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves. That is their right and duty, to be at all times armed, and that they are entitled to freedom of person, freedom of religion, freedom of property, and freedom of press.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. The teachings of God's Word are the best friend civil government has because these teachings deal with the heart. Only by dealing with the heart can crime be prevented. For as Jesus explained in Matthew 5, all crime comes from the heart. Understanding this, Daniel Webster, the great defender of the Constitution, once declared, the cultivation of the religious sentiment represses licentiousness. It inspires respect for law and order and gives strength to the whole social fabric. Whatever makes men good Christians makes them good citizens. Indeed, it is not the good Christians whom the police arrest for armed robbery, gang activity, or other such crimes. Understanding this, the Founding Fathers encouraged religious instruction, for as Daniel Webster so accurately noted, good Christians make good citizens.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Thomas Jefferson said, in questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down for mischief by the chains of the Constitution.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. Our guest today, our good friend, State Representative Matt Krause of Texas. Great new article, A Gross Overreach in Houston. Representative Krause, thanks for coming on, brother.
Hey, thanks for having me. Always good to be on.
Well, thanks for the great service you do for the state of Texas and, frankly, the country with the example we're setting here in Texas. But sometimes the example isn't so good, which is what's happening in Houston. And you've written an article saying, look, these guys have overreached, but actually that may be a good thing.
Yeah, well, it has brought attention, hasn't it? I mean, I can't remember the last time so much national attention has been focused on the Bible and sermons from the pulpit, especially about a political topic. So sometimes these things can turn out for the good if you do it the right way.
Yeah, it does seem to be certainly waking people up, getting them to discuss the issue. And, man, you talk about in your face an example of government power being abused to force a private citizen, a pastor, let alone, that's simply exercising their First Amendment rights, and force them to turn over every document that covers a particular topic, and then, of course, a chilling effect on all the other pastors in the area. This could have a very negative impact on churches if we don't push back.
Right, that's exactly right. And, everybody keeps saying, well, this is just a part of the judicial process. Discovery happens all the time. Once they started a lawsuit, they were kind of asking for it. But you're never asking for a fishing expedition or a broad subpoena or something that's beyond the pale. And so when the mayor and the city are asking for 17 different forms of communication, including private emails, private text messages, from these pastors on a wide range of issues, it's hard to go ahead and say that this is part of the normal legal process.
You pointed out in your article that it took fewer than 140 characters in her tweet, the mayor, to show her lack of understanding of the law. She said if the 5 pastors used pulpits for politics, their sermons are fair game, were instructions given on filling out anti-hero petitions. So, if she's saying if you even spoke on this issue and if you told people about the petition or how to fill it out, that somehow that opens them up to government intervention. Tell us why that's wrong.
Yeah, there's this fundamental misunderstanding in our culture today that pastors and churches can't do anything political. If they talk about anything that has to do with the political realm, then they've exceeded their bounds for tax-exempt status, and their 501c3 status should be revoked. But the 501c3 is very clear. Pastors and churches can't endorse or oppose specific candidates for office. Everybody agrees with that. But then the IRS says, they can't do any kind of talking on legislative topics, referendas, constitutional amendments, if it constitutes a substantial part of their activities. And so what substantial part of activities is open to debate, but we know from federal case law that it's less than 15% and it's more than 5%. And so, and they take the aggregate of how many hours pastors work, how many hours children's pastors work, how many hours the church is open. So at a large church, you've got hundreds of hours each week that can be used for that, to speak on that topic, and I guarantee you the churches have not overstepped their bounds. So their sermons aren't fair game because they're not doing anything that they're not allowed to do under Section 501c3. In fact, we would encourage pastors to do that more and to be a voice to their congregations for what's going on in the political sphere.
So based on that 16% thing, I mean, even if you spent significant time, in terms of your a few minutes out of each sermon every week, or you even had a full-time staff person doing those things, but you got 10 other staff people doing other things, you're still within your boundaries of what the IRS's view. I mean, of course, my view is you should be able to spend whatever time you want talking about whatever you want in terms of freedom. But even in the IRS's view, you're allowed to have that, roughly less than 16% of total time of that church's activities on these local issues that might be happening or cultural issues that are happening.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you think about some of these big churches, they have maybe 15, 20, 50, 100 people on staff. And if they're all full-time, that's 40 hours a week for 100 people. I mean, so there's just no way the pastors could ever overstep their bounds at these large churches, even if they devoted every sermon for an entire month or an entire quarter or half the year to speaking out against certain things like the hero petition here in Houston. And so for them to think that somehow they've done something illegal or outside the bounds is just another intimidation tool, I think, to keep them silent.
State Representative Matt Krause from Texas is our guest today. Stay with us. We'll be right back here on WallBuilders Live.
John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court recently overturned the jury sentence of a man convicted of the brutal murder of a 71-year-old woman because the prosecuting attorney had mentioned a Bible verse in the courtroom. Yet consider what happened in the 1778 case, Respublica versus John Roberts. Thomas McKean, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was the Chief Justice of that court, and addressing John Roberts after the jury had sentenced him to death for treason, McKean told him, "You will probably have but a short time to live. Before you launch into eternity, it behooves you to repent of your evil deeds, to be incessant in prayers to the great and merciful God to forgive your manifold transgressions and sins, to teach you to rely upon the merit and passion of a dear Redeemer." This prominent founding father actually delivered a salvation message to the defendant in the courtroom.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
President Thomas Jefferson said, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power."
We're back here on WallBuilders Live. Our guest today, State Representative Matt Krause. The article is called A Gross Overreach in Houston. We'll have a link today at wallbuilderslive.com so that you can read it. We're talking about this issue in Houston where the city is literally going after pastors, demanding their private communications if those communications in any way address this this ordinance that the city passed. Not too many people are even talking about what this really is all about. I mean, this is, has been nicknamed the bathroom bill. I mean, what we're talking about is a city ordinance, much like the laws in California and Massachusetts and a couple other liberal states that have said we're going to let a guy that day decides he's a woman go into the woman's bathroom and that is going to be legal for that public bathroom where our daughters would be or our women would be, and so naturally there has been an uprising in Houston. Over 50,000 people, as you mentioned in your article, that signed the petition and said this is lunacy. We don't want this to happen in our city and in our state. So it's not some. I mean, this is real battle. These are things that will affect your kids and your family. That's what has drawn these pastors in to speak. Do you think that it's important for you as a public official and other public officials for people to speak? I mean, if these pastors didn't do this, and if citizens didn't rise up, does the political environment just assume, well, that's what the people want now?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, everybody will tell you who's in elected office, what they respond to is hearing from the people. If they never get a phone call into the office, if they never get an email expressing their pleasure or displeasure with what an elected official is doing, there's really no way to gauge what's going on except maybe every election cycle. But when things like this happen and the community gets motivated and involved, this sends a strong message not only to those in Houston but all around the state that, hey, this is an issue that we do not like, that we do not approve of. And if you keep trying to force this down our throats, then there's going to be we're going to get involved and we're going to make some noise to try to keep you from doing that.
How important is it for not just pastors, frankly, citizens, all of us, for these organizations that are now coming alongside the pastors, the Alliance Defending Freedom, Liberty Counsel, Pacific Justice Institute, all these legal groups around the country that Liberty Institute here in Texas that go out and for free of charge go represent these pastors and others. How important is that for pastors to feel confident in being able to stand up and speak and know they're not going to get bankrupted at their church from legal fees?
Oh, I think it's huge. I mean, most of these churches, even if they are large, don't have the resources or the ability to fight these things in court. I mean, just think about all as an attorney yourself, you know how one side can just inundate the other side with just paperwork after paperwork and motion and just kind of try to drown them by paperwork. And so if you didn't have people willing to come along and do it for free so the church could continue to focus on the things it needs to focus on, the church would either have to abandon what its core mission is, or it would have to spend all of its time in court or spend all of its time on its mission and forget about what's happening in these court cases. So I can't say enough about those organizations that come alongside the churches, especially what we've seen in Houston, for pro bono service to make sure the pastors and the churches can continue to do what they need to do, and that is to be salt and light to the community.
Does it surprise you, Matt, that this is happening in Texas, of all places? I mean, when we see this in California or Massachusetts, we go, oh, we got to fight it, but, we kind of expect it almost. But Texas?
I can't tell you how many people have written me from around the country and said, Matt, what's going on? This is in Texas? Are you kidding me? This is Texas, right? What are you guys doing, or what's going on? Because everybody around the country seems to look at Texas as still kind of that shining city on a hill in regards to the rest of the country. We seem to be doing things right and on a better track than most all the other states. And so when something like this happens in Texas, I think that sends shockwaves to everybody else saying, hey, it could happen to us really quick.
Yeah. So in that case, then it's important how Texas responds to it, right?
Yeah, exactly, and that's why I'm so glad the pastors are not going quietly. In fact, I was speaking with the pastor at a big church in Houston, at Forest Champion Baptist Church there in Houston. I was meeting with the pastor last week, and on my way out, he said, hey, here's my sermon that I'm sending to Mayor Parker. He's not one of the 5 that got subpoenaed, but he said, hey, if she wants my sermons, I will send them to her. And so I really appreciate how the pastors are responding. They're sticking up for their fellow brethren in the ministry, and they're having a boldness to stand up and say, this is not a fight you want to have, but if you mean to have it, we'll give it to you.
Yeah, I love it. I think every pastor in the country ought to mail in and email in and just inundate these Houston officials with good sermons. Hey, never hurts to hear God's word, right?
Right, and that's the other funny thing is I guarantee all these sermons from all these churches are already online. They're already streamed. She could have already gone and listened to any one of these sermons that she wanted to, but it was the other forms of communication that even get into privileged communication on the text messages and emails that shows that it was so beyond the pale, and I think that's what's got everybody up in arms.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to watch. Appreciate you being a part of it. Let's get you back on and get an update as things move along.
Yeah, that sounds good. It's always good to be with you, Rick.
Appreciate you coming on, man. That's State Representative Matt Krause. Back in a moment with David Barton.
Thomas Jefferson said, in questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down for mischief by the chains of the Constitution.
Have you ever wanted to learn more about the United States Constitution, but just felt like, man, the classes are boring, or it's just that old language from 200 years ago, or I don't know where to start? People want to know, but it gets frustrating because you don't know where to look for truth about the Constitution either. Well, we've got a special program for you available now called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green, and it's actually a teaching done on the Constitution at Independence Hall in the very room where the Constitution was framed. We take you both to Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty in Independence Hall, and to the WallBuilders Library, where David Barton brings the history to life to teach the original intent of our founding fathers. We call it the Quick Start Guide to the Constitution because in just a few hours through these videos, you will learn the Citizen's Guide to America's Constitution. You'll learn what you need to do to help save our constitutional republic. It's fun, it's entertaining, and it's going to inspire you to do your part to preserve freedom for future generations. It's called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green. You can find out more information on our website now at wallbuilders.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
President Calvin Coolidge said, "The more I study the Constitution, the more I realize that no other document devised by the hand of man has brought so much progress and happiness to humanity. To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race."
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live, Foundations of Freedom Thursday, and today we're talking about that freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. Pastors under attack in Houston, Texas, simply for speaking out on an issue that is clearly a biblical issue. And David, our Constitution is precious. We are blessed to live under that Constitution. But, if we don't stand up when our rights under the Constitution are being violated, then those precious rights go away.
Two things that stand out to me from what you guys were talking about. One is, and it is defending our rights, but you're talking about how nice it is to have groups that will come alongside and stand with these pastors and work with them. 50 years ago, there's not a church in America that would have budgeted even $1 toward legal defense. Now, if you're a church in America, you better figure a few $100,000 that you need budgeted for this. But fortunately, we got these guys that come alongside and do it for free. But if you're a pastor in California, the government out there has told you that you will fund abortions as a church. Your church will fund abortions. Well, they're having to fight the government on that. They'll go all the way to the Supreme Court with it. That's usually a several $million enterprise to go to the Supreme Court with it. Churches can't afford that, but these groups have come alongside and picked up the standard on that. So it's saving churches more money than they can imagine. The other thing that I want to pick up is what Matt said, that even under the current IRS code, which we don't think is constitutional, but even if you take that, you're allowed to spend anywhere from 5 to 15% of your time. So just think you're a small church. You only have, the pastor is the only staff at the church, and he works 40 hours a week. 15% of 40 hours a week is 6 hours. He could stand in the pulpit next Sunday and speak for 6 hours about any political measure or issue he wants to and be within IRS guidelines. Now, no pastor's going to do that, but if he's a pastor and he has let's say he has a secretary, he has one staff member, he could spend 12 hours in the pulpit the next week talking about those issues and be within the IRS code. And then let's say he's got 3 volunteers that work in the nursery and they give 20 hours a week each. Well, there's another 60 hours. So that's another 9 hours. So the next week he can spend 21 hours. See, people don't understand, even under what they think is a restrictive IRS code, there's no way you're ever going to cross the line on speaking about these kind of political issues. And the hero issue in Houston for pastors to stand and speak about that, Mayor Anise Parker is dead wrong. She went to the wrong law school somewhere, because even under the IRS current code, which we think is unconstitutional under all history, there's no way you're going to get close to crossing that line, and those pastors in Houston did not. But they've got to stand and defend their rights.
Absolutely. It's great to see them doing that. I'm actually encouraged by the way people are responding to this gross overreach of government there in Houston. Thanks for listening today. Thanks to Matt Krause for being with us. You've been listening to WallBuilders Live.
George Washington. The Constitution approaches nearer to perfection than any other government hitherto instituted among men.
We stand undivided.